to another AZ-Ray video. Today we're going to talk about Frankenstein. Hope you guys enjoy this. Beginning, we're going to do a fun little skit. I'm going to be in and out of makeup, so it might be a little funkier, but yeah. Thank you guys. Appreciate your love and support. Alright guys, we're about to get into it. So the way we're going to break this film down, we're going to break it into 8 parts. First, we're going to do a story time because this film is near and dear to my heart. More like the films are too, but the book itself made an impact on me when I was a little kid. So I'm going to talk about that for a little bit. So that's the first part. On the second part, we're going to break down a little bit about horror on the understanding from horror section. After that, we're going to go into breaking down Frankenstein lore. Part 4, we're going to do various cultural analysis regarding the book. And the reason I'm using this cultural analysis, because I think it's going to present me a stronger theme and giving you my point of view if did Guillermo del Toro do a good job on capturing the deeper undertones and messages of the book. So I'm going to use some other researchers and theorists and other people that wrote on these topics. So I'm going to talk about the cultural analysis. 5th part, we're going to talk about themes and symbols. On the next part, for the 6th part, we're going to talk about the anatomy of a monster and breaking down all the various themes that have to do with monster culture. 7th part, we're going to get into the spoiler section. And the very last part, the 8th part, is going to be my review. All right, guys, let's get into it. So right now we're just going to do a little bit of story time. The first section of this video here. This isn't a very important story for me because Frankenstein had a very big impact on me. I read the book when I was 11 or 12 years old, and it profoundly changed my life, especially being a little brown kid of color. You know, there was a lot of times where I kind of felt like a monster. I felt like certain people in my life were monsters and kind of influenced me. So definitely Frankenstein spoke to me in this deep loneliness that I was feeling and some of the different themes that were in the book. So when I heard about this new adaptation, I was really excited to check it out. So I poured my heart and soul in this video, guys. Hopefully you guys appreciate it. I did a lot of different contextual research with it, and we're going to break those things down. And yeah. Overall, it was a good film. I enjoyed it, but you're going to hear my breakdowns and the other points. And I got really lucky to go to an early screening, and I actually was gifted a really cool poster that I'm going to show you guys. So this is one of the posters that I got. It was actually gifted to me by an awesome family member of mine. And here's another poster that I was actually able to get as well. It's an early screening. I was really excited to be able to go to some early screenings, and I was really excited to make this video for you guys. I wanted to make sure I had a very compelling video that talks about some of the deep themes with technology, nature, all the various symbolisms, because this story means a lot to me, guys. And yeah, thanks again for your support. And we'll have timestamps as we always do in all our videos. We're going to have some spoilers about the book in case you guys haven't read the book, and we're going to have spoilers regarding the movie. That's going to be its own section, its spoiler section. It'll be part 7 of the various sections where we actually talk about spoilers regarding the film. All right, thanks you guys. We're going to get into the next section, which is anatomy of horror. All right, guys. So I don't know. I think this monster takes a little nap. I'm not feeling myself, I'm just going to take a nap between certain takes of this, and maybe I'll regain my regular complexion. Guys, let's get into it. For this part, we're going to break down the understanding of horror. So horror is that thing that's lingering in the background. It's this unknown. It connects us to our human curiosity, right? You have ghost stories. You have things that are lingering in the shadows, lingering in the dark. And horror demands audience participation. It's a reason why it's probably gaining popularity nowadays once again, because it forces the audience to participate. Horror invades our privacy. And there's something in our human nature that draws us to horror. We can't really explain it exactly. And horror has been something that's been existing for as long as humankind has existed. We have ancient examples of monsters such as the Sphinx, the Centaur, the Minotaur, the Griffith, and we have modern example of monsters. You have the Wendigo, various ghosts, the Invisible Man, or also the Frankenstein creature or Frankenstein monster. Some examples of some modern monsters. The term monster actually comes from medical terminology for an abnormal or irregular fetus. And we can see a lot of roots of the horror that were essentially a counter movement that were happening during the Enlightenment. And in their time, a lot of horror authors were shunned and hated during their time, but are now currently revered, like H.P. Lovecraft, Robert W. Chambers, Mervyn Pike, were detested in their time, but now they're become beloved. You have different notions of monsters. Pre-romantic monsters had a different reimagining, and older mythologies. Monsters were essentially created for heroes to kill them. Modern monsters are a little bit different. Modern monsters are harder to kill, and you often remember them more. They're like the most memorable part of the story. And the monster has way more emphasis in the story compared to the hero. And now to make these horror aspects comparable to things that were happening in the time with the film, with the story, with Frankenstein lore. We're going to get into the Frankenstein lore in the next section, but we're going to touch on it just a little bit. So some of the roots that are connected to it is that we have to understand at this time that when the book was written, like in the 1816 or 1818, something like that, in the early 1800s, we have the rise of aristocracy. And Victor's Frankenstein character represents that. And so in many ways, he is a monster in that aspect because he's like this upcoming threat of this burgeoning class of wealthy people that are like having power, right? The bourgeoisie was this like people that coming into like high class that also represent power dynamic and intelligence. Now that you guys have a better understanding through the analyzing horror as a culture and how it came to be, we're now going to analyze the next section, which is the Frankenstein lore. And before we get too much into the lore itself, we are going to get into the next section, which is the breaking Frankenstein lore. But I'm going to talk about the emphasis of Milton, because arguably this book is a parallel to Milton's Paradise Lost. And why is that so important, right? Because Milton is a very compelling writer, and what he was able to do is that in many ways he modernized this idea that still plays a role to this day of kind of like romanticizing the villain. He made the devil seem attractive. He humanized the devil. He gave a compassion and understanding. And this theme has been seen in all kinds of different forms of lore, right? Some people even call it in modern times the Darth Vader effect. There's a reason why we're appealed to all these dark horror monsters. You have like maybe even like Freddy Krueger, or you have Dracula. The Joker is also another example of a very appealing villain that like captures the audience's attention. And so we have all these themes that even played a role even back then. And what we have to understand too, Milton had a Puritan origins. So that's what brings us the appealing part of the Puritans, is the Puritans were some of the rising bourgeoisie and high class people of the time. So we see this contrast between censorship. And because we had these radical Christian ideals trying to censor everything around the community and just arguably literature in that time, we see that horror was a natural response to this censorship. And so we see the rise of the bourgeoisie, and we see this conflict between the castle and the field, right? The working man and those in power. And we see this contrast. And it's a reason why a lot of Gothic themes and Gothic architecture are in horror. Especially in a film like this, you can see that a lot in the set design. I'm gonna get into that later, but you see the origins and the roots, and during all these different like Gothic times, and the complex nature between censorship and horror, and you can see the different origin themes. Now that we give you a little background with the Frankenstein lore, with it's like a Milton thing, and the reason why I brought it up too is because Guillermo del Toro said in various interviews in the production of this that he wanted this film to become essentially a Miltonian tale. So that's why I touched on Miltonian on that part of it. And now we're going to break down the book a little bit, but we're also going to touch upon some of the movies, not too much, but just to kind of give you an understanding. And it also kind of make more sense for my argument that I'm going to do later on of the conclusion of this video. In the book, Victor completely abandoned his creation. He is upset and he is completely frustrated, right? He has this like Faustian thing that happens, right? And who is Faust? Faust is this famous fictional character that arguably sold his soul to the devil. So there's this theme that's in every version and every lore of Frankenstein that he made this forbidden creation, right? He sold his soul. He did the unthinkable. He broke morals, and he did this very powerful thing. Also interesting, going back to different things with like Puritan and horror and things regarding the Faustian tale, is actually the word daemon was used. It's kind of a spelling of demon, but it's spelled Daemon. But it's actually used. It's used as a term for neutral spirit. But actually, that term has been like used and reimagined in different ways, and now demon has become the traditional word that we know today as like some kind of evil entity. But it used to be have like a neutral spirit element to it. But these also play a role because of like interpretations of evil kind of fluctuate and change depending on culture, zeitgeist, and whatnot. Spoiler alert, because we're gonna get into some things regarding the book. I'm mostly going to be spoiling things around the book. So if you want to skip ahead, we'll have timestamps as we always do. So if you don't want to hear anything about the book, go ahead and skip ahead. It might make it a little harder for you to understand my argument in the end because of like the various details and why I use the book to compare and contrast. But I'll still have some elements of the book that aren't spoilers to better help out my argument. But it's up to you. You choose your own journey how you want to watch this video. All right, guys, we're going to get into it. You've been warned, spoilers for the book. So essentially, the Frankenstein monster essentially represents all the dark desires that Victor Frankenstein wants to fulfill. And so Victor never truly wanted to marry Elizabeth, and the monster is able to ultimately kill her and kind of breaks him free from his dark desires. And Victor ultimately wants to destroy the monster because the monster will help eliminate his own dark desires and his dark secrets, right? And that's the true reason why he wants to murder and eliminate the monster. Because first, the shadow in the book, the in many ways, the monster, which is very shadowy and mysterious, initially the monster chases the victim, but second, the victor chases the shadow, right? So it kind of has this theme of like curiosity without caution. And that's arguably the biggest theme of the book, that, you know, you can have curiosity, but you have to do with caution. And Victor Frankenstein didn't have that caution. So we're out of the spoiler section. Now, what I'm going to analyze too is some compelling arguments having to do with Mary Shelley and some of the deeper themes that probably allowed this author to write this dark tale. Mary Shelley's life was surrounded by tragedy. So Mary Shelley had a very tragic life. One of the first tragic incidents is that her mother died giving birth to her in 1797. Mary's first daughter dies after 13 days of her being born around 1815. And around 1816, this is when she did her infamous pact with her husband and Polidori about competing to create these horror tales. So in 1816, her half-sister commits suicide. In 1817, her second daughter dies at the age of 1 during the illness. In 1817, her second daughter dies at age 1 due to illness. In 1819, her first son dies of cholera at the age of 3. In 1822, her husband, Percy Shelley, dies in a boating accident. So she is surrounded by all this tragedy. And in many ways, all these dark things that happen to her, a lot of psychologists feel like the deeper roots and messages, and psychoanalysts and psychologists have analyzed that the book has to do with some of the tragedies and the complexities of motherhood and conception, and as well as reproduction, because the monster was never nurtured, right? It was put into this like world, in this very destructive world, and was forced to get some kind of like destructive nature. And Mary Shelley was only 16 when she was first pregnant, and she wrote Frankenstein when she was 19. So there's this close relationship with all these like tragedies that were surrounding around her life. And I gave you kind of a timeline of the things that were happening to her. And so you can see that in many ways, like the book itself is kind of telling about its own like unnatural and natural process. And then going back to the earlier comments that I said earlier in this film, that the idea of a monster being like an abnormal fetus, you can see this like complex and tragic monster things that are happening even within her own life that you can argue that in some ways it's a very real life horror tale. There's other deeper themes that people have analyzed this, especially psychologists and psychoanalysts. Like they've seen that like essentially after the monster's created, Victor essentially kind of falls into this like postpartum sleep, which is a very common phenomenon that happened to people while giving birth. And the creation of a monster represents a very like unnatural way of giving birth and creation. And Victor also says, like in the book, conception. And they purposely use the words conception and incredible labor and dilate. And the workshop is of a filthy creation, instruments. And they also, another quote that's in the book too is the word mummy, which, mummy is another way of kind of saying mother. So there's all these like purposeful hidden themes of motherhood in the book. And also some other themes that are familiar with the creation process that a lot of psychologists and psychoanalysts have analyzed when it has to do with the lore regarding Frankenstein, where like sexuality and its consequences are a deep theme when it comes to the adolescence, because when you're an adolescent, that's when the first time where sexual encounters have consequences, right? You have the ability to be able to procreate and to have kids, right? And there's a creation metaphor that's associated with sexual arousal and all the various forms and all the various films that are related to Frankenstein. When the monster's created, you see like almost like an orgasmic look when the scientist is able to like fulfill this creation, right? There's like this hidden like sexual undercode that's in all those different things, right? Because it's like this forbidden, taboo, hidden nature, and there's this completion of it, and it's like this like repression that was held in, and now it's this almost unbelievable thing that's happening. And this is where there's different contrasts when it has to do with the books and the films. In most of the films, the monster ends up in many ways being a child, but in the books and every like interpretation or version that you see of the original book by Mary Shelley, the monster is an adolescent. So they're a little more developed and they have like a little better surrounding of the world. The 1931 film directed by James Whale does some differences compared to the original movie. In the 1931 film, we see that like I said previously, the Frankenstein monster is more like a child, and Elizabeth tries to stop the monster from being created. And the monster scares Elizabeth, but doesn't kill Elizabeth in the original film. And Dr. Frankenstein should feel like a god, but ultimately ends up kind of feeling like a mother in different ways. And the original 1930s film does a good job of making a doctor kind of more of like of a vulnerable character and kind of being torn with what to do with the Frankenstein monster. So in contrast to other important myths of that time, you have the vampire who tells you who not to bring in bed, right? Kind of represents like various undertones, potentially LGBTQ. I talk about that in my other film where I talk about vampire lore, which when we talk about Nosferatu, check that out. But Frankenstein represents all the unnatural, the non-traditional, because Frankenstein was not conceived in any kind of traditional way. Horror monsters like Frankenstein, they interrupt courtship. Humans make mistakes, but monsters never do. Frankenstein always hurts those that deserve it, right? It's like very methodical. Some have even compared the Frankenstein myth to the Jewish legend of Golem. And in many ways, the Frankenstein film turns Adam into Satan, right? Since Frankenstein is kind of like the first thing that's created, and it turns him into Satan. That there's like this unlikable, destructive monster. And just a note into like some of the other films, like Bride of Frankenstein, which is arguably a much better film than the original 1931 film. And what's very interesting and compelling is that the Bride of Frankenstein actually hisses at the Frankenstein monster, because in many ways the bride, which carries Elizabeth's heart, represents the mother of the monster. And so the hissing could be interpreted as some kind of incest. So it would make sense why the relationships are forbidden. It would make sense why the bride would be hissing at the Frankenstein monster. Other famous Frankenstein interpretations are the Hammer films. And the Hammer films are pretty compelling, especially like The Curse of Frankenstein talks about like the nurture versus nature dynamic. Or monsters born? Is it in their nature? Is it inevitable? So another compelling story within the Frankenstein Hammer films are Frankenstein created women, and it has very deep themes and talks about the various complex a soul and what's a human body and who exactly says what's what, right? Where do the lines play a role in? It's kind of has a Being John Malkovich vibe to it before Being John Malkovich. The themes of the Frankenstein lore is that the Frankenstein monster is this tragic figure that didn't have any choice of being created, but was created and was brought into this world, and it creates this complex tragedy and this complex horror elements, and it you have to like analyze the story on different layers on exactly who to blame and the theme and the deeper message of like who's the monster and who's at fault for the creation and whatnot. So now we're going to get into the fourth part. We're going to talk about the cultural analysis about the film. And so we're going to go into different psychological takes. I know we did a little bit about the lore, but we're going to go a little deeper. Going to do some like feminist theory and do some overall cultural analysis. All right, guys, let's get into it. So for the first part, we're going to talk about everyone's favorite psychologist, Sigmund Freud, repression. Freud's theory of repression. And what he talks about a lot is about what happens within the unconscious mind. So we have this Freudian ideal of like suppressed thoughts and suppressed unconscious mind and like the suppressed individual. So in many ways, a person has been caged up, right? And there's like this performative aspect that there's this part of ourselves that we have caged in, right? So like some kind of animal or some kind of like bird in the cage. And there's like this inner desire that's not allowed to be free. Freud states that we all have repressed desires and fears. Freud believes in the significance of dreams. Freud uses a psychoanalytic approach to interpret dreams, and he uses that same idea to interpret the various symbols that writers convey in their various forms of fiction, and refers to symbols as some kind of like dream stories. Carl Gustav Jung, a contemporary Freud, kind of broke off with the Freudian approach and didn't like his emphasis on sex, and kind of used this idea of that literature wasn't just repressed desires, but a manifestation of what is held by the human race and was repressed as a society in general. Alfred Adler wrote on the inferior complex, that sometimes like authors were writing from that perspective of like kind of feeling inferior and whatnot. And then you have Jacques Lacan, a French structural theorist that focuses on language and treated unconscious as language. And Lacan's had kind of controversial sexist ideals by associating like maleness with order and women as like a secondary thing. And Lacan also broke things down within the imaginary and symbolic realm. As we use like the Lacan approach or various other psychologists' approach, we see the monster represents some kind of deformity, some kind of creature, but at the same time, the deformity in the monster represents a mirror image of Victor. Victor always wanted to be a monster. Often people that judge others as monsters are never really the monster, right? Because when it comes down to it, those people that are labeled as monsters simply want to be human, but are often not given the ability to be human. And now to go to like some of the feminist critiques regarding the book is that the book has no female voice. The book is centered on three male perspectives. We have Walton, Victor, and we have the monster. And the book was also published anonymously, which also reflects and tells the viewer and us, the audience at the time, that it kind of reflects all the female oppressed themes in this male dominated world of the 1800s. Mary Shelley's husband also played a big role in the editorial process. So in some ways, some people even believe that Percy Shelley may have even played a role on the suppression of the voice and maybe the suppression of various female characters involved in the story of the book. To analyze also the feminist perspective when it comes to the book, once again, we're talking about how in many ways Victor's character was cooped up. He was, and in many ways it critiques the nature of being homeschooled and the freedom of science and discovery and breaking boundaries. Quote from the book that arguably represents the theme of the entire film as well as the entire movie. My own spirit let loose from the grave, set to destroy all those close to me. This next session, we're going to go into some spoilers regarding the book because we're going to talk about the various deaths that are associated with the monster. So you've been warned. We're going to get into the specificity of the various deaths associated with the Frankenstein book. The first death, and arguably all the deaths of the rampage of the monster, represent an attack on femininity. Elizabeth represents the domestic stereotype. Alphonse represents the caring and nurturing and feminine father because he's attached with his emotional side. Henry represents Victor's best friend, who's like the emotionally available and smart companion that was intelligent but also was pretty well grounded. Williams, Victor's younger brother, was under the care of Elizabeth and Justine the servant. So like he was surrounded by all this like nurturing and like positive femininity and nurturing environment. So all those you can be seen as critiques and attacks of femininity. The novel also argues against a very common notion within the Enlightenment, right? Because there was this common idea that when you take care of your kids and you have to be nurturing and caring, because if you don't nurture your kids properly, you might create some kind of evil kid or some kind of wrongdoer. But Mary Shelley actually pushes the complete opposite of that. She actually argues that that things aren't so black and white, and that oftentimes it's not all completely up to the parents what happens to an individual. There comes a point where a person has to self-nurture and work on personal development and grow as a person. And a person has to take responsibility for their own actions, and they can't really like blame their parents or their upbringing for for the reason why they do things and whatnot. And she also argued that society kind of puts all these like gender roles and these pressures of like this perfect ideal society and this ideal family, and it also kind of hides these like hidden domestic pressures and violence and like chaos. And sometimes when we try to like abide by these roles of this picture perfect family, we actually don't also create like this very healthy and nourishing environment or this unchallenged environment. So sometimes we have to also kind of reflect when it comes to those different things, because although you have like a nurturing upbringing, ultimately up to the individual who they become. So it's a very interesting and honest take from the author regarding that. Shelley also exposes the ideology of domestic violence and the fake harmony or trapped gender roles masked behind violence and failure, because that's the thing too. There was a lot of domestic violence that was happening during this time, and it unfortunately still happens today. And so for us to act like everything was harmonious, even if there is the perfect role of the perfect family, it's often not the case. And another compelling thing that was very interesting, this is also on the spoiler section, so you've been warned. We're going to get into something regarding spoiling the book, is that when Victor Frankenstein was asked to create a female counterpart for the monster, he was nearly completed, but then horrified himself. Why? Because his idea on femininity was challenged, because he saw this creature as not being beautiful. And often the case when it comes to femininity and females in general, especially during like the 1800s at this time, females were seen as just an object of desire, not as someone who was some kind of individual. So his notions were challenged by seeing this quote unquote hideous creature that he created. So ultimately, Victor's isolation and his obsession with science led him into a dark path, and it led him very unbalanced. He wasn't able to become grounded, and he wasn't able to find emotional balance. And he completely neglected his empathy and his family care, and he was overshadowed by his obsession with his creation. So for this part, we're going to talk about the themes and the symbols. So first, we're going to talk about like the Gothic themes that are relevant with the film. Some of the marvelous set designs and some of the various costumes that were associated with this time period, because this film does a very cool thing in general. And I can understand why ultimately Guillermo del Toro pushed this storyline into the 1860s and whatnot, because he was like, hey, let's add electricity, and essentially kind of asked the question, like, how would you actually potentially create this monster? And so it was cool how he did that. And in the background, he had all these deep like Gothic structures. You know, in Gothic and horror have like a natural marriage to each other. Anglo and French architecture has a lot of ancestry with the Middle Ages and whatnot. And it has like various spires and towers. And Gothic architecture often flirts with life and death. And some of the most recognized features of Gothic architecture are pointed arches, gargoyles, and stained glass windows. So, another symbol we're going to touch on is the Iron Cross. You see it throughout various scenes in the film. And the Iron Cross originates from the Croatian military and associated with the 1813 Crimea Wars, which were essentially a rebellion against the Napoleonic like empire that was trying to rise. So the Crimean War was like this European balance of power. Essentially, Europe was kind of afraid of Russia getting more in control. So there was an alliance that was formed with Europe, with the European Empire to counteract the Russians, which was the Ottoman Empire, France, Britain, and Sardinia and Piedmont. And there was this, this fear of Russian control and for also Russia to kind of interrupt the trade with India. So that was cool that element was also added to the film as well. One of my favorite things that the film added too is that they also had Middle Eastern technology involved into it and kind of used it as a way to kind of use this galvanism and these ideas to like make this creature come to life. Galvanism is this idea of using like electricity to put certain objects in life or to kind of have some current into them. In some ways, we have some kind of like shock therapy that was used later on down the line. We also have like, even till this day, we even have like electric shock, like laser hair removal. So galvanism kind of still has some roots today as well. That we see that happens a lot in this film as well as in the books. There's various things within the Frankenstein lore is the theme of the number 3, right? We have like the 3 parts of the butterfly that's alluded to some part of the film. We have the relationship between Elizabeth, the monster, and Victor. And then we have the same kind of love triangle dynamic between Victor, his brother, and Elizabeth. And then we also have arguably like it's the monster, the doctor, and like everyone else within the plot. Whether it's in the book, it's like Henry Clerval, the best friend, whether it's the dad, whether it's the brother, whether it's like everyone else, right? So there's this like there's this theme of 3s. Another thing related to the book is that the bride that was going to be formed for Frankenstein was actually created 3 years after the inception of the initial monster creation. Another symbol of 3 is the fact too that we have this like dynamic of like the narrators of the books, which is Walton, explorer that we see in the Arctic that ends up finding Victor Frankenstein, and we see the monster itself. So there's another theme of 3. And then another thing that we have with 3 too is like probably the 3 generations of the Frankenstein lineage. We have Frankenstein, which we're talking about the dad. And then we have Victor Frankenstein. And then we also have the monster. So we have another theme of 3 right there. For the next part, we're going to jump into the anatomy of the monster. So for this section, for the anatomy of the monster, what we have to understand that the monster in any kind of form of genre, whether it's this film, another film, or even when it comes to like kaiju stuff in Japan, is that the monster represents like the ultimate otherness, right? It's like the taboo. It could be even like LGBTQ non-binary. It's like this thing that we fear. It's this thing that affects us. A lot of the things that I use to kind of to ground my argument for this video essay, I use books such as Dreadful Pleasure. This kind of played a big role of kind of giving me a deeper understanding of the various themes of the horror genre and like the sexual undertones. And then as well as Gothic Europe, which allowed me to understand like the various implications of Gothic architecture and its roots and its complexities that played a role within religion. And it was kind of like a hidden undertone that was kind of like flirting on the lines of like the repression that was happening during the Enlightenment as well. And great book that my wife got me from Frankenstein. It's a second edition by Mary Shelley, but it has like, it was edited by Johanna M. Smith. And it does a good job of having various criticism like psychoanalytic, feminist, gender, Marxist, cultural. So that kind of gave me a deeper understanding and helped me like better understand the whole idea of the monster and the relationships and how like the monster represents like the ultimate other And that's why like the monster is so compelling. It represents sin, evil, sexual assault, criminals, disruption of morality, taboo, serial killers. So monsters represent all these dark things, right? And monsters allows us to explore all these dark issues that normally we that aren't talked about in society, hence like the taboo comment that I referenced earlier. And then the thing about monsters is that because most of the time they're non-human, it kind of gives us the liberty to kind of talk about something without having to feel kind of guilty about it, because like, oh, it's not human, it's monster that's doing. So that's just a quick note on the anatomy of a monster. And on the next section, where this is going to be a spoiler section, but this is going to be the spoilers for the 2025 Frankenstein film by Guillermo del Toro. So you've been warned. If you want to skip ahead, it's completely up to you. If you want to watch it, we'll have timestamps as we always do. All right, guys, let's get into it. So for this part, right? So the spoiler section. So some things that are interesting that Guillermo del Toro did to reimagine the film is that he essentially split up the characters of Victor and William, and he basically split up the human aspects of the Victor character into two people instead of one. I kind of didn't like that, to be honest with you. It was cool that William was actually given a role, since he in the book he dies off probably at the halfway point, and now we see him as a character, but he, in my opinion, he wasn't his own character. In many ways, he was like the reflection. He was like the prodigal child that the parents probably always wished they had and had like the successful career. So that's kind of one of the drawbacks that kind of like bothered me about it. It created like this whole Cain and Abel dynamic, how both were kind of trying to battle for like approval of God's love, or maybe their parents' love, or the legacy of the last name dynamic. So there's like that element to it. And then there's other things too that I found also potentially problematic. I wasn't too big of a fan of the way the Elizabeth character played by Mia Goth was killed into it. In my opinion, it completely threw off and kind of removed any potential redemption for the main character of Victor, because I felt like both of the characters weren't sympathetic. Throughout the entire film, the most sympathetic characters were Elizabeth and the monster. And Victor Frankenstein, in my opinion, wasn't very sympathetic of all. I don't mind that Guillermo del Toro like reimagined the story and the plot, but I think he kind of got lost in the sauce a little bit. And I am a big fan of his work, and I enjoy the film throughout. But I think if all three of the characters were more sympathetic, it would be a much more compelling and more engaging story overall. One of my favorite things regarding the film were Jacob Elordi's depiction of the Frankenstein monster. It was very compelling in my opinion. And Mia Goth was phenomenal and arguably probably the best depiction of Elizabeth that we have to date. Oh yeah, another thing, the story was split up in three parts: prologue, Victor's story, and then we have the Frankenstein story, the Frankenstein monster story. And so I wasn't a fan of the Victor story because I felt like it wasn't as sympathetic, and I feel like the character wasn't likable at all. And I'm a fan of Oscar Isaac as an actor. All the actors did a good job, what they could do in the constraints like of the film, but there wasn't enough like sympathy and gray area, in my opinion, for Oscar Isaac's character. In my opinion, he was just kind of a jerk. He was like an overambitious scientist that was obsessed with this thing, but with the creation of the monster. But there was nothing like sympathetic about him. There was no remorse for all the wrong things he did. He didn't feel bad for like lusting and longing for his brother's wife. He like did all these immoral things, and it's like, aren't we supposed to be sympathetic to this guy? It was like very clear right off the bat that we were supposed to hate this guy and he's the villain and he's the monster. And it's okay if that was the case, but I feel like if we had a little more sympathy, it would have overall kind of represented like the ethos and the deeper themes of the Frankenstein original story written by Mary Shelley. All right, last section, guys. Let's get into my review. My review for this film. As I stated in the beginning, this is a very important film for me because Frankenstein played a big role in my life. It like shaped me. So it was really hard for me to like kind of rate this film because I wanted to like it, but I'll be honest, I came with very high exceptions. And I'll be completely honest. And The movie is not better than the book. I don't think any of the films have come close to the book, and not because that's always the case, but I feel like sometimes I feel like the films kind of miss the point of the book. And I think the whole point of the book was kind of like it's this gray story of like somebody getting stuck in this unfortunate tragic tale, and now we have to pick up the pieces from this grave mistake of this grave creation that like Victor Frankenstein made. And I feel like film kind of didn't do a good job to do that, because ultimately the Miltonian theme of every type of Miltonian story is that you have a character that has some kind of downfall and they redeem themselves. And in my opinion, some of the characters, and I talk about this in the spoiler section. In my opinion, some of the characters don't redeem themselves. So we don't have that happen there. And because in my opinion, the characters were never redeemed and they were never sympathetic, I can only like give this film so much of a rating. I ultimately landed on a 7.6. It's a really good film. There's a lot of beautiful symbolism. The set design were great. I had problems with the dialogue. For my opinion, it was too over the top, and I feel like it kind of spelled things out a little too much for the audience. Like, I feel like you didn't have to over explain too many things, and I feel like there was a lot of things that I would have made a little less dramatic, and I had some problems with it. Overall, though, it's still a good film. I still recommend it. It's going to be coming on Netflix, so definitely check it out. And yeah, thank you guys for checking out this breakdown from A to Z. Thanks for hanging out with me. Do you guys agree with me, or am I crazy? Leave a comment below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and put on the notification bells. Thank you guys for all the support, and you have an awesome Halloween, guys. Thank you so much.